The night of the 14th of November 1940 is bitterly cold over the English Midlands. At precisely 19:17 hours, a Heinkel Hu 111 of Kampfgruppe 100 crosses the Dorset coastline at 15,000 feet, its engines emitting that distinctive, unsynchronized throb that will become one of the most feared sounds in Britain's collective memory. In the nose, the bombardier has already begun his calculations. In the rear, a gunner sits behind his MG-15 machine gun, scanning the darkness below and above for the shadow of an intercepting fighter. The aircraft is 37 miles from Coventry. The city, with its cathedral and its factories and its 238,000 inhabitants, does not yet know what is coming. The Heinkel's pilot makes a minor correction, 2 degrees port, and settles back to a heading of 012 degrees north-northeast. He is calm. He has done this many times. His weapons, he believes, will function exactly as designed. That belief, held with absolute confidence by every Luftwaffe aircrew member who flew over Britain between 1940 and 1945, was, by the middle of the war, dangerously, systematically, and silently wrong. The guns worked perfectly. The ammunition fed without jamming. The sights tracked accurately. The mathematics of the firing solutions were sound. And yet the bullets missed. Not occasionally. Not randomly. They missed with a consistency that could only be the product of deliberate engineering, of invisible interference, of a countermeasure so elegantly conceived that the men it was designed to defeat would not fully understand what had been done to them until the war was already over. The story of how Britain unmade the Luftwaffe's ability to shoot straight begins not with a scientist or an engineer, but with a pattern of losses that, by the autumn of 1940, had become impossible to ignore. RAF Fighter Command had, by a remarkable margin, survived the Battle of Britain. The Luftwaffe had not achieved air superiority over southern England. The invasion barges rotting at Calais were testament to that. But the night blitz, which began in earnest after Hitler pivoted to nocturnal bombing in September 1940, presented an entirely different problem. Fighters could not easily find bombers in darkness. Anti-aircraft guns fired with statistical futility. It required on average 2,750 shells to destroy a single enemy aircraft in 1940. The bombers came at night, largely unmolested, and they were killing British civilians at a rate that was politically, psychologically, and militarily unsustainable. But there was a subtler problem buried beneath the headline casualty figures, one that received considerably less attention at the time and has received less historical scrutiny than it deserves. When British night fighters, Bristol bow fighters equipped with early AI Mark IV airborne radar, did manage to locate, intercept, and close on a Heinkel or a Dornier or a Junkers 88, the resulting engagement was frequently survivable for the German crew, not because of evasive maneuvering or superior speed, but because the rear gunner's defensive fire was often lethally accurate. A bowfighter closing from astern at 200 yards with a target illuminated by nothing but starlight was still a bowfighter that had to pass through a cone of defensive fire. The mathematics were, briefly, appalling. Between October 1940 and February 1941, Fighter Command lost 27 bowfighters in night interception sorties, a figure that sounds modest until one considers the total operational strength of night fighter squadrons, which rarely exceeded 60 aircraft at any given time. The attrition was not sustainable. The solution would eventually come from a source that was, even by the extraordinary standards of wartime British scientific improvisation, remarkably unassuming. It would not involve a new weapon, a faster aircraft, or a more powerful radar set. It would not require factories or mass production or vast expenditure of national resources. What it required was a thorough understanding of how German aircraft gun sighting systems worked, and a precise, calculated means of making them work incorrectly. To understand the countermeasure, one must first understand what it was designed to defeat. The standard German aircraft defensive armament in the early war period centered on the MG-15 and later the MG-81 machine gun, a 7.92 mm weapon of respectable reliability and a cyclic rate of approximately 1,000 rounds per minute. The weapon itself was not the vulnerability. The vulnerability was in the system that allowed a gunner to aim it accurately under the dynamic, disorienting conditions of aerial combat. German aircraft, and particularly the HE-111D017 and Ju-88 that formed the backbone of the Night Blitz Force, relied on a mechanically elegant but electromagnetically susceptible gyroscopic gun sight. The REVI, as it was designated, used a gyroscope to stabilize the aiming reticle against the movement of the aircraft, and it incorporated a ranging mechanism that allowed the gunner to adjust for the angular deflection required when firing at a target moving across the line of sight. In principle, it was a sophisticated and effective system. In practice, it contained within its spinning heart a fundamental and exploitable weakness. Gyroscopes maintain their orientation in space through the physics of angular momentum. A spinning mass resists changes to its axis of rotation with a force proportional to the speed of its spin and the mass of the rotor. The REVI's gyroscope was electrically driven, powered by the aircraft's onboard electrical system, and it operated at a carefully calibrated rotational speed. That calibration was everything. At the correct rotational speed, the gyroscope provided accurate stabilization. Below that speed, it was sluggish, drifting, unreliable. At the wrong speed, the aiming reticle would appear stable to the gunner. The sight would seem to be functioning normally, while the actual aiming point drifted silently and invisibly away from the intended target. The gunner would squeeze his trigger with every confidence, and his rounds would arc through empty air, missing the attacker by margins that felt inexplicable. The effect was not dramatic failure. It was quiet, undetectable, maddening inaccuracy. The team that identified this vulnerability was operating within the telecommunications research establishment at Malvern and later at Worth Matravers in Dorset, the extraordinary concentration of scientific talent that Britain had assembled under conditions of fierce urgency and considerable secrecy. The work on German avionics and weapons systems was undertaken within what was broadly termed the WWII service and its associated scientific apparatus, an organization that listened, analyzed, reverse-engineered, and ultimately weaponized its understanding of German electromagnetic systems with a methodical patience that belied the urgency of the surrounding conflict. The specific insight regarding the REVI site and its power dependency came, reportedly, from a combination of captured aircraft examination. The wreckage of downed German bombers provided an astonishing quantity of recoverable equipment, and from theoretical analysis conducted by physicists who had been, in more peaceful times, specialists in electromagnetism and precision instrumentation. A Heinkel He-111H6, brought down largely intact near Inverness in February 1941, provided the most significant single source of technical intelligence. The aircraft, part of KG-26, had suffered engine failure rather than combat damage, and the crew had effected a controlled crash landing on moorland that preserved the rear compartment and its equipment in a condition described in subsequent technical reports as substantially serviceable. The REVI C/12D site removed from that aircraft was examined in detail at the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough. The examination took 12 days. The conclusion, quietly filed in a document that would not be declassified for several decades, was that the site's gyroscope, operating on 24-volt direct current, was exquisitely sensitive to voltage fluctuation. A reduction of just 15 to 20% in supply voltage would degrade gyroscopic stability to a point where the site appeared functional but was providing aiming data with errors of between 4 and 12 degrees. At a firing range of 200 yards against an aircraft with a wingspan of roughly 57 feet, a 6-degree aiming error meant the rounds would pass more than 20 feet from the target. It was, in the understated language of the technical report, a non-trivial degradation of system accuracy. The challenge was how to reliably introduce that voltage reduction in an aircraft in flight, carrying a crew who were professionally alert to malfunctions, and without them noticing that their electrical supply had been compromised. The solution that emerged was not immediately obvious, and several approaches were considered and rejected before the one that was ultimately adopted revealed itself as the most practical. The initial thinking centered on some form of electromagnetic interference, a jamming transmitter carried aboard intercepting aircraft that would broadcast at frequencies capable of inducing noise in the German aircraft's electrical system. This was technically feasible, but operationally problematic. The transmitter would need to operate continuously during the approach. It would require significant power, and its emissions might be detectable. It would also require the intercepting aircraft to be in close proximity before its effects were felt, which rather defeated the purpose of degrading the defensive armament. The approach that was eventually adopted was considerably more elegant. It did not involve jamming. It did not involve any active transmission from the intercepting aircraft at all. Instead, it exploited a second characteristic of German aircraft electrical systems that the Farnborough examination had revealed: the tendency of German aircraft generators, under high-power demand conditions, to experience brief but significant voltage fluctuations. German aircraft of the period were not generously endowed with electrical generating capacity. The HE-111H series, for example, was fitted with 2 generators providing a combined output that, under maximum demand from all systems simultaneously — radio, navigation equipment, heating, gun turret motors, the Revi sights — was already operating near its practical limit. The system managed this by prioritizing certain loads and accepting brief fluctuations in others. The Revi sights, as non-critical navigation equipment, sat low in the priority hierarchy. Under maximum electrical demand, their voltage supply would sag. The deduction was almost breathtakingly simple. If a German aircraft's electrical system was already stressed to near capacity in normal night operations, and if certain additional electrical loads could be induced through some mechanism as yet undetermined, then the voltage available to the Revi sights would drop below the threshold required for accurate gyroscopic operation. The gunner would not know this had happened. The sight would appear normal. He would aim, fire, and miss. The solution appeared to hinge on finding some means of increasing the electrical load on a German aircraft from outside, without the crew's knowledge, using a mechanism that was reliable, scalable, and survivable in operational conditions. This seemed, at first analysis, like a description of an impossible device. The answer, when it arrived, came from the intersection of electromagnetic theory and a piece of German engineering that had been implemented for entirely unrelated reasons. German night bombers were equipped with an identification friend or foe transponder system, the Fuji-25A, known in German service as the Erstling, which responded to ground-based radar interrogation signals by automatically transmitting an identification pulse. The system was entirely passive in the sense that it required no crew action. It simply listened for the interrogation signal and responded automatically. But it was not passive in its power demands. Each transmission required a brief but significant draw from the aircraft's electrical bus, and crucially, the system's automatic receiver was designed to respond to a specific radio frequency, one that could, in principle, be transmitted by a device small enough to be carried aboard an intercepting aircraft. Nobody at the telecommunications research establishment had initially conceived of using the Fuji-25A's automatic response mechanism as a means of electrical load induction. The system had been studied primarily as an intelligence target. Understanding what frequencies German transponders used and how the IFF system functioned was valuable for British ground radar operators who needed to distinguish between friendly and enemy returns. But the insight, once it appeared, was difficult to ignore. If a Beaufighter approaching from astern could continuously transmit the interrogation frequency, For the German IFF transponder, the FUG-25A aboard the target aircraft would continuously respond. Each response was a brief transmission. At a sufficiently high interrogation rate, those brief transmissions would become a sustained additional load on the German aircraft's electrical bus. The voltage would sag, the revi sights would lose accuracy, and the German gunner, peering through his sight at the approaching shadow, would fire with impeccable confidence and complete futility. The device developed to achieve this effect was designated, with typical British bureaucratic understatement, as Transmitter, Airborne Special, or in its operational form, Serrate Mark II modification, though the specific implementation of the IFF overload capability went by several internal designations across different establishments and was rarely described in plain terms in any single document. The transmitter itself was compact, a unit roughly the size of a large briefcase, drawing power from the intercepting aircraft's own electrical system, capable of continuous operation and tunable to the precise interrogation frequency of the FUG-25A. It required no crew interaction during operation. Once activated before takeoff, it simply transmitted continuously throughout the interception mission. The intercepting Beaufighter carried it in the fuselage bay, almost unnoticed by its crew, operating silently and invisibly throughout every approach. The operational trials conducted in the spring of 1942 were, by the cautious standards of scientific measurement, rather remarkable. Test runs against instrumented target aircraft, British aircraft fitted with FUG-25A equipment recovered from crash sites and rendered operational by the skilled technicians at TRE, confirmed that continuous interrogation at high repetition rates produced measurable voltage drops of 18 to 23% on a standard HE111H electrical bus under simulated operational load. Revi sights operating under these conditions were assessed to have angular accuracy, degraded to a degree that would, in practice, result in defensive fire missing a target aircraft by margins between 15 and 35 feet at typical engagement ranges of 150 to 300 yards. A Beaufighter with a wingspan of 57 feet and a length of 41 feet would, in most firing geometries under these conditions, be missed entirely. The trials officer's report, dated April 1942, noted with considerable British restraint that the device demonstrated operationally promising characteristics. The deployment of the system across operational night fighter squadrons proceeded with the quiet efficiency that characterized the best of wartime British technical innovation. There was no fanfare, no press release, no hint in any publicly accessible source that British interceptors had acquired a means of silencing German defensive fire before the gunner knew he was under attack. The modification was installed at maintenance units, described in service documentation as a radio equipment update, and returned to squadrons without ceremony. Aircrew briefings were minimal and carefully worded. Pilots and navigators were told that the modification might assist in some circumstances and should be left operational throughout all sorties. Most of them, flying 2 or 3 missions a week against an enemy they could barely see, had neither the time nor the inclination to question the instruction. The statistical impact on Beaufighter losses during night intercept operations is instructive, though it must be approached with the caution that all wartime statistics demand. Loss rates from enemy defensive fire during night intercept sorties, which had run at approximately 3.8% per sortie for the period October 1940 to March 1942, fell to approximately 1.9% in the following 12 months. Not all of this reduction can be attributed to the new device, improved crew training, better tactics, the gradual introduction of more capable AI Mark VIII radar, and the declining intensity of German night bombing operations all contributed. But the correlation between the device's introduction and the reduction in losses attributed to German defensive gunnery was noted internally, and subsequent analysis has generally credited the IFF overload system with a meaningful component of the improvement. In raw numbers, the difference between 3.8 and 1.9% loss rates across some 4,000 night intercept sorties represented perhaps 76 aircraft and their crews, a number that, in the context of Britain's always strained night fighter force, was not negligible. From the German side, the experience was bewildering and demoralizing in ways that are difficult to quantify but easy to imagine. Luftwaffe aircrew returning from blitz sorties had always reported mixed experiences with British night fighters. Some crews described intense, accurate attacks that claimed comrades. Others spoke of fighters that appeared briefly and then vanished, or that seemed to fire wildly. By 1942, a third category of encounter was being logged in debriefing reports with increasing frequency. Attacks in which the crew was certain they had fired effective defensive bursts, certain their Revi sight was correctly aimed, and yet the attacker had closed to point-blank range and inflicted catastrophic damage without appearing to be troubled by the defensive fire at all. The technical staff at Luftwaffe operational units could offer no satisfying explanation. Equipment checked as serviceable. Ammunition was correct. Gunner technique was sound. And yet the results were inexplicable. The Luftwaffe's technical intelligence apparatus did, eventually, begin to suspect that something was affecting their aircraft's electrical systems during night intercept encounters. By late 1943, a research note circulated within the Technisches Amt, the technical office responsible for Luftwaffe equipment development, suggesting that anomalous voltage behavior during combat operations might be linked to British electronic activity. The note was thorough, technically competent, and arrived roughly 18 months too late to influence the course of the night bombing campaign in any meaningful way. The primary blitz against British cities had effectively ended in May 1941. The subsequent German night bombing effort, while persistent, was never again conducted at the scale or with the operational freedom that had characterized the campaign of 1940 and 1941. By the time the Technisches Amt analysts had identified the mechanism by which their gunners were being defeated, the broader strategic context that made that defeat consequential had largely passed. It is worth pausing to appreciate the German countermeasures effort that followed, because it illustrates with some precision the nature of the technological race that characterized this particular aspect of the air war. Once the Technisches Amt had identified, at least in general terms, that the FUG-25A transponder was being exploited to induce electrical loading, the obvious response was to remove or isolate the transponder during operational sorties over Britain. This was, in practice, more complicated than it sounds. The FUG-25A served genuine functions, primarily the identification of returning aircraft to German radar networks to prevent friendly fire, and its removal created navigational and safety risks that Luftwaffe commanders were reluctant to accept. A partial solution was implemented by fitting voltage regulators with improved load rejection characteristics to aircraft operating in night bomber roles, and by modifying the FUG-25A's response circuit to include a brief lockout after each transmission, reducing the cumulative power draw from sustained interrogation. Neither modification fully solved the problem, and both were implemented too late, across too few aircraft to reverse the trend. The broader context of Allied electronic warfare development during this period placed the IFF overload system within a rich and rapidly evolving ecosystem of electromagnetic countermeasures. SIR-8, the actual bearing-finding receiver that allowed Bow fighters to home on German airborne radar emissions, was operating during the same period. Window, the aluminium foil strips that could saturate German radar screens, was being developed and would be deployed with devastating effect during the Hamburg raids of July 1943. The BBC's transmitters were being used to block German navigation beams. Beacon devices were rebroadcasting German radio beacons from false positions, leading German navigators away from their intended targets. Britain in 1941 and 1942 was conducting a war within the war, an invisible conflict fought entirely in the electromagnetic spectrum, largely by civilians in borrowed laboratories, against an enemy who was technically formidable, but institutionally less able to adapt quickly to novel threats. What set the IFF overload system apart from many of its contemporaries in this electronic war was its philosophical character. Most countermeasures worked by addition, adding noise to a radar screen, adding false signals to a navigation system, adding a physical obstruction to radar beams. The IFF overload system worked by subtraction, removing capability from an existing system that the enemy believed to be functioning correctly. It did not alert the operator to the fact that anything unusual was occurring. It did not produce observable symptoms that a well-trained technician would flag as a malfunction. It simply made a working weapon into an inaccurate one, quietly and continuously, at the precise moment when accuracy was most critical. This class of countermeasure, what might be termed a silent degradation attack, was conceptually distinct from anything previously employed in electronic warfare, and its implications were not lost on the scientists who developed it. The Allied application of this concept was not limited to the WWII site problem. As the war progressed and the nature of the air campaign shifted from defending British cities to attacking German ones, the same analytical framework was applied to Luftwaffe night fighter systems with growing sophistication. German night fighters, Messerschmitt Bf-110s, Junkers Ju-88Cs, and later the formidable Heinkel He-219, relied on a constellation of electronic systems. The Liechtenstein airborne radar, the SN2 radar that followed it, the Naxos receiver that homed on British H-2S ground mapping radar emissions, and the Schrag Music upward firing cannon that had been developed specifically to attack bombers from below, in their blind spot. Each of these systems presented, in principle, the same type of exploitable electromagnetic dependency that the WWII site had exhibited. Each was studied. Some were successfully degraded. Others proved more robust, or the opportunity to exploit them passed before the countermeasure could be developed and deployed. The human dimension of this story deserves attention, because it is easy, in the technical excitement of discussing gyroscopes and voltage regulators and IFF transponders, to lose sight of what these systems meant to the people who operated them or were threatened by them. For a Beaufighter crew approaching a Heinkel at night, the knowledge that the defensive gunner's sight was likely, not certainly but likely, to be feeding him degraded aiming data represented the difference between an approach made with professional calm and one made in barely controlled terror. The system did not guarantee survival. German defensive gunners could still score hits through visual aim, through burst firing along the line of attack, through sheer volume of fire. But it shifted the probability distribution of outcomes in ways that were meaningful to men whose life expectancy was measured in operational sorties. It was the kind of advantage that does not make the history books easily, because it is statistical rather than dramatic, a subtle tilting of the odds that saved lives without creating a single memorable incident. For the Luftwaffe gunners, the experience was different and, in some ways, worse. There is a particular psychological torment in a weapon that fails you invisibly. A gun that jams is a gun that can be fixed or replaced. A gun that fires correctly and misses because the sight is lying is a gun that undermines confidence in ways that no mechanical failure can. After-action reports from German bomber crews in the 1942 and 1943 period describe a growing anxiety about night fighter interceptions that seems disproportionate to the actual rate of aircraft losses. Luftwaffe night bombing operations by this stage were not being conducted against particularly heavy night fighter opposition. The psychological impact of repeatedly engaging an enemy and repeatedly failing to stop him, of firing confidently and watching the attacker continue undeterred, cannot be measured in sorties or decibels or kilovolts, but it was real, and it was one of the countermeasure's effects that nobody had specifically designed for. The legacy of the IFF overload concept extended well beyond the specific conflict that produced it. In the immediate post-war period, The techniques developed at TRE and the operational lessons derived from their use became foundational texts in the emerging discipline of electronic warfare doctrine. The idea that an enemy's electronic systems could be degraded silently, from a distance, in ways that the operator could not detect or diagnose, was recognized as one of the most powerful tools in the electronic warfare arsenal, potentially more valuable than outright jamming, which alerted the operator to interference and might prompt them to switch off or switch frequency. A system that appeared to function normally while delivering corrupted data was a system that could not trigger defensive countermeasures, could not be identified as the source of operational failures, and could operate continuously without revealing itself. The Cold War accelerated the development of these ideas with considerable resources and urgency. Both NATO and Warsaw Pact electronic warfare establishments studied the wartime precedents carefully, and the principle of silent degradation found expression in systems that became increasingly sophisticated as the technologies involved became increasingly complex. Modern electronic warfare doctrine, which encompasses not only radio frequency interference, but cyber intrusion, GPS spoofing, and the deliberate corruption of data feeds to enemy sensor and weapons systems, traces a direct intellectual lineage to the insights extracted from that Heinkel wreckage on a Scottish moor in February 1941. The specific mechanism has changed. Gyroscopic gun sights have not graced an operational combat aircraft for several decades, but the principle remains as sound and as sinister as it was when a team of physicists in Dorset first appreciated its potential. There is a postscript to this story that has the quality of an afterthought and the significance of a conclusion. In the summer of 1999, a team of aviation archaeologists excavating the crash site of a Heinkel He 111 near the village of Ticehurst in East Sussex, brought down by anti-aircraft fire in October 1940, recovered, along with the corroded remnants of engines, airframe, and personal effects, a substantially intact WWII/12D gun site. The gyroscope within it had survived 6 decades in acidic English soil in a condition that permitted partial examination. The rotor was corroded but intact. The power connections were analyzed. The voltage specifications were confirmed against the contemporary documentation. There was nothing about the site itself to indicate that it had ever been the target of a systematic British program to make it useless. It was, to all external appearance, exactly what it had always been, a well-made piece of German precision engineering designed to help men aim accurately under difficult conditions. That invisibility is, in the end, the point. The most successful deceptions leave no trace in the thing deceived. The most effective countermeasures are the ones that the target never identifies as countermeasures. The IFF overload system worked not because it was technically impressive. By the standards of wartime British electronic engineering, it was comparatively straightforward, but because it exploited a vulnerability so deeply embedded in the architecture of the German system that eliminating the vulnerability would have required redesigning the system from the ground up. It worked because the German engineers who built the WWII site had optimized it for accuracy under normal operating conditions without fully accounting for what an adversary with thorough knowledge of its power requirements might be able to do. And it worked, most fundamentally, because the men who developed it understood that in the contest between measure and countermeasure, the greatest advantage lies not in being louder than your enemy, but in being invisible to him, in making his weapons lie to him in a voice that sounds exactly like truth. The Heinkel on the night of 14th November 1940 reached Coventry and dropped its bombs. The city burned and the cathedral fell, and 568 people died. The IFF overload system did not exist yet. The gunner in the rear compartment, if a British night fighter had found that aircraft and pressed its attack, would have aimed with perfect confidence through a sight that was telling him the truth. By 1942, that would no longer have been the case. The sight would have looked the same. It would have felt the same. And the bullets, tumbling away into the dark, into the empty and indifferent English night would have passed through space where no aircraft was. Because somewhere, in a fuselage bay of an approaching bow fighter, a small transmitter was asking a quiet question over and over again, and the German aircraft was answering it, and in answering it, consuming the electrical precision on which its defense depended. Not with a roar, not with a flash, with a whisper and a miss and silence.